He violated his own sisters. Above all, he loved the phrase, "hit him so hard that he feels like he's dying." He personally tortured the prisoners with a dull saw, gouged out their eyes, and mutilated women's breasts and men's genitals. His name was Gaius Caesar Caligula. He was only 25 years old. It was hard to believe that a year ago, a young, attractive emperor had ascended the throne by the will of the people. The Romans referred to him as our sunshine. He lowered taxes, provided amnesty to political prisoners, and eliminated the system of denunciation. And he transformed into a beast in one horrific night. But who or what turned the young, virtuous emperor, renowned for his wisdom, into a monster? The doctors and staff left. He remained in the royal suite. There was no one in the room except him and the ailing old emperor. The boy cast a keen eye on the power ring that shone on Tiberius's hand. The emperor opened his eyes and raised his hand to signal that he wanted to be left alone. However, he had no intention of obeying. He impatiently seized the emperor's hand and removed the ring. At last, he held the much-coveted symbol of power. Fear filled Tiberius's eyes. The old man attempted to call security immediately. But before he could, Caligula smothered his face with a pillow and pressed down with all his strength.
Thus began the reign of one of the most renowned Roman emperors, Gaius Caesar Caligula. This day was his retribution for the mortal affront the old emperor had imposed on his family, murdering his father, mistreating his sisters, and degrading his mother. Caligula sought revenge for everything. Yet in the process of killing the emperor, he didn't realize how he was becoming a more fearsome monster than the one he had slain.
He tried to recall the exact moment that brought the first misfortune in his childhood. It seems he was around 7 years old. That day, Gaius was playing with his sister Drusilla. He hid a coin and asked his sister for a kiss as a hint for ransom. The sister declined. Then she instructed me to close my eyes, approached Guy, and kissed him on the lips. The boy blushed and held his sister close. Suddenly, their father entered the tent with a heavy stride, looked at his children with a weary gaze, and wheezed out, "Son, call for your mother." Guy felt his body stiffen, but he had to run to find his mother. He ran, swallowing his tears. A terrible sense of foreboding overwhelmed him.
Caligula translates to little boots in Latin. This is how the soldiers fondly referred to the boy. He dined with them at the same table, wore leather boots known as caligas, and dressed in typical soldier's attire. He was the darling of the entire Roman army, much like his father Germanicus, who was the adopted son of Emperor Tiberius and co-ruled the empire with him.
My mother was weeping over my father's corpse. Commanders and soldiers arrived. From their discussions, Hai was terrified to discover that his father had been poisoned, and he couldn't understand why. His father had a genuine opportunity to become the sole emperor. A few months before his death, Germanicus saved the Romans from famine. Against Tiberius's will, he ordered the opening of state granaries and reduced the price of bread. The rescued people carried him in their arms. Tiberius was cursed.
It was evident to everyone who the killer was. The esteemed commander was poisoned by the decree of the emperor. A rebellion was now simmering within the military to dethrone the cruel Tiberius and avenge him for the killing of Germanicus.
They didn't have time to stage a mutiny. The emperor acted preemptively. Soldiers and generals loyal to the late Germanicus were captured and executed. His family, his wife Agrippina, their sons and daughters, were transported to the province of Capri on a slave ship. When the seats became available, the mother gathered her children, tears welling in her eyes. Each of you must do whatever it takes to avenge your father's death. Several years have passed filled with hatred and plans for revenge. Finally, Caligula is 17, and his mother makes up her mind. In Rome, there are likely still individuals loyal to Germanicus and his family. Such individuals existed here, on Capri. They are the ones who will help Caligula escape from here and reach Rome with a letter, an order to act. The night before the shipment, he sat with his sister in his arms. His heart was pounding in his chest. Fear and a sense of something extraordinary kept him immobile, and Drusilla stroked his head, resting it on her lap. With her alone, his excitement subsided. Only she soothed his soul and filled him with hope. He didn't realize at the time what his feelings for his sister were called and the damage they could cause to both of them. The sister gave him a firm kiss on the lips. He left the room and froze. Tiberius's guards were standing around. They had a bloodied Agrippina in their hands. He suddenly understood what had happened. Their plan had been revealed. Someone had betrayed them.
The man hurried to his mother, but the guards wouldn't allow him. He choked back tears, looking at his bloodied mother, and then something happened that he will never forget. The soldier, looking straight into his eyes, stabbed his enemy in the chest with a dagger.
The boy's eyes darkened. He suddenly lost all his senses. He could not see, hear, or even move a finger. A sharp pain ripped through his head, and then the world seemed to turn upside down and everything disappeared. He regained consciousness in Rome. The emperor's doctors were close by. How did he end up here, in the palace, where his relatives were? Anxiety sent his head spinning. The doctors prepared a tincture and warned, "You should drink this every morning." Gaius angrily spat out the potion. "I won't be poisoned like my father." The physician then clarified that Caligula was afflicted with a terrible plague. After the attack, he remained unconscious for several days. It was only the intervention of the benevolent Emperor Tiberius, who took the boy under his care and provided top-notch physicians, that saved him from death. Stay tuned without any commercial interruptions. How did Caligula save the treacherous emperor from certain death? Tiberius and Caligula. Imperial-style sadomasochism. Gladiator battles. Caligula spares the life of his potential assassin. Indeed, the physicians were mistaken about the benevolent Tiberius. The emperor despised both his deceased stepson Germanicus and his son Caligula. Instead, it was the young Caligula who was viewed by the army as the successor to Germanicus, and thus the new co-ruler with Tiberius. The Council of Commanders demanded that the family of Germanicus be released from exile and that Caligula be installed in the position of his late father. The emperor hesitated, buying some time. Discontent within the army was escalating. The prospect of mutiny was becoming apparent. It was during this period that Caligula and his mother were planning an escape, which they failed to execute. When the emperor found out about the assassination of Agrippina by his guards, he understood that it was the end. His own life will be worthless. The army will overthrow him from the throne and perhaps even behead him. And then he came up with a plan.
Tiberius decided to use Caligula as a pawn. He announced that he would take the ailing child, Germanicus, under his care, bring him to the palace, and entrust him to the finest doctors. The Council of Commanders acknowledged this decision as noble. Thus, Caligula found himself beside the murderer of his own parents and surprisingly acted politely.
Tiberius was taken aback. His nephew, who was expected to seek personal vengeance for him, or at the very least become a tool in the hands of his adversaries, turned out to be a weak and compliant young man.
Caligula appeared small, frail, and insignificant, and did not present any threat to Tiberius. On the other hand, it is more satisfying for a sadist to ridicule a fool, a jester, or a poor person. And it's understandable that Tiberius had sadistic tendencies. Therefore, I believe that Tiberius did not view Caligula as a formidable adversary. He did not perceive him as his potential assassin. After all, this is what I essentially paid for.
6 years alongside my worst enemy. It was absolute torture. The Emperor Tiberius was a man inclined towards sadism, and he mistreated his nephew as much as he could. How many times did Guy want to plunge a knife into that full belly? But each time he held himself back. He observed the behaviors and routines of his adversary, keeping a close eye on him. The only thing that undermined Caligula's confidence in his own power was his illness. Curse it. If the attack occurs at a pivotal moment of vengeance, everything will be in vain. He concealed the onslaught of his illness. As soon as he sensed its approach, when darkness shrouded his mind, he hastened to his room, clenched a stick between his teeth to prevent biting his tongue, and waited in fear for the convulsions to begin. However, the repercussions were the most terrifying. Caligula understood that after one of these attacks, he might not rise again, and he cursed destiny for such a dreadful and punishing disease, which he still hoped to overcome.
Epilepsy is a very challenging condition and a serious disease even today. The disease impacts an individual, and this epilepsy progressively deteriorates their personality, leading to irreversible changes that render them entirely dysfunctional. Such individuals, unfortunately, often end their lives in isolation, in specialized psychiatric hospitals.
He endured the humiliations from Tiberius and frequent bouts of epilepsy, but the letters from Drusilla's sister caused him the most pain. They were filled with love, but even more so with sorrow.
I am writing to you, not knowing if you are still alive, dear brother. If it's not too much trouble, could you possibly send us some food? My younger sister and I are starving, and fear we might soon join our deceased parents. Perhaps that would be better?
He read and wept. He knew that his family was undernourished, that they were living in harsh conditions, and here he was in the palace, like a bird in a gilded cage. However, he couldn't do anything. He couldn't even ask for them, because he had to pretend to be weak, foolish, and inscrutable. Tiberius ridicules him. However, Caligula frequently noticed his stern, suspicious gaze, as if the emperor doubted his loyalty, anticipating him to falter and reveal his true nature. And then that's it. Tiberius will destroy it. He could not let this happen, and he stubbornly waited for his opportunity. Eventually, he got it.
Roman circus. Here, the citizens of the mighty empire experienced the most exhilarating moments of their lives. When your heart races, you perspire and you realize that someone's life hinges on your single action. Gaius watched these spectacles and battles with distaste, but was obliged to accompany his uncle. When he lowered his finger to signal death to the gladiator, Caligula bit his lip. If the emperor suddenly appeared in the arena, then Gaius would gladly lower his finger and watch the execution without turning away. Indeed, he simply felt pity for these unfortunate individuals who perish with a mere wave of the hand, how their destiny mirrors his own life.
But that day, something went wrong. The crowd's favorite, the German Gnae, entered the arena. He defeated 6 opponents, one after the other. The citizens of Rome were elated. The German triumphed. He defeated everyone in a fair fight and could now bask in glory. However, even though the arena was covered in blood, the patricians were concerned. They had few casualties. And that's why, when they raised their hands, all of them, as one, pointed their thumbs down to sentence Gnaeus to death. Caligula observed as the stunned gladiator staggered, fell heavily onto one knee, and lowered his head, but his eyes blazed with animosity towards the arrogant patricians, this depraved audience, upon whose caprice his life hinged. Caligula caught this gaze. His heart suddenly started pounding wildly. He is Gaius Caligula, the very same gladiator who stood in the arena before Tiberius, bowing his head in apparent humility. And his soul was also boiling with rage. Caligula could not stand this. The executioner raised the axe over Gnaeus' head. The crowd roared, unable to wait any longer. Suddenly, there was a shout. "Halt! In the name of the emperor, I command you!" The weary man in the center of the arena rose and looked gratefully at his savior. Tears welled up in Gaius's eyes. He felt as if he had saved both the gladiator and himself. The patricians waited, but Tiberius simply smiled and raised his finger. Let it be. Allow Caligula to enjoy the company of the noble savior, and let the army witness once more Tiberius's kindness towards the unfortunate orphan. Caligula saved a man. This filled his heart with joy. He remembered his father and thought that he would be proud of his son, as the rescued gladiator would then become his loyal friend. He would trail Gaius like a shadow, and no one in the arena at that time or afterward could have foreseen that Gaius was not only saving his future friend, but also his eventual killer. The following day, the old emperor's good mood had faded. He discovered that his nephew had purchased the freed slave. Tiberius recalled the immense desperation, youthful vigor, and determination in that cry. Tiberius was livid. He abruptly realized that this action was the first sign of Caligula's defiance. Indeed, what he had subconsciously anticipated from him. Finally, this jerk showed his true colors. In a fit of rage, he called out to Caligula, extending his hand. Gaius blushed, but he did what he had learned to do perfectly. He lowered his head and whispered, "If I am guilty before the emperor, let the emperor punish me."
The punishment was not postponed, but Tiberius remembered. The army is at his back, so he acted cynically and issued 2 decrees to humiliate Caligula. First, he declared that his mother Agrippina's birthday would henceforth be a day of mourning in Rome. Second, he released a list of all the nation's adversaries, a technique that was successfully employed by all subsequent tyrants. There were only 2 individuals on that list, Caligula's own brothers. After they were declared enemies of the state, their lives were not worth a single penny.
The man read a letter from his sister, which contained horrifying news. One of their brothers had died of starvation, while the other had taken his own life by cutting his veins. His suicide was provoked by the soldiers of Tiberius, by decree of the spiteful emperor. The sister wrote that this letter might be her last, as she is unsure if she will have the strength to endure the hunger. A terrible gloom seized Gaius's mind. His father was poisoned, his mother was murdered, his brothers were slain, and now his beloved sister is starving to death. He lives next to his adversary, the foe of his entire family, shares his bread, and even exchanges smiles with him. Enough is enough. The time for retribution has arrived. The man sprinted through the palace corridors. Finally, there he was, the gladiator Gnaeus. A loyal protector and friend, he would be of assistance.
During the night, turmoil erupted in the palace. The servants were scurrying and bustling about. Beyond the door lay the ailing emperor. He had suddenly become ill after dinner and lost consciousness. It was rumored that they attempted to poison the emperor. Whispers echoed through the corridors, and glances were cast towards Guy. He was the prime suspect, and now, if the emperor recovers, he will face inevitable punishment.
Gaius was engulfed by a surge of terrifying panic. He was certain that once Tiberius recovered, he, Caligula, would be accused of attempted murder, just like that servant. A few days would pass, and heads would roll. Gaius listened anxiously to the news about the emperor's health. Gladiator Gnaeus did everything correctly, except that the dose of poison was likely too small. Gaius anxiously overheard the doctors whispering near the emperor's chambers. Tiberius is asleep. His stomach has been cleansed. He will survive. His fate is to live, was the realization that dawned on Guy, and then he understood. He must take the reins. He must act. Either Tiberius would recover and ruin him, or he wouldn't let the despot rise from his bed. A twisted smile froze on Gaius's face. You need to crush the viper's head before it has time to deliver a fatal bite and finally rid yourself of this headache. The man was certain that all the attacks stemmed from hatred. Eliminate its cause, and the pain will disappear forever.
In a moment, Guy found himself in the imperial bedroom. Tiberius opened his eyes, looked at Guy, and weakly waved his hand, saying, "Go away." But Gaius seized a pillow, covered the ill tyrant's head with it, and pressed it down firmly. He sensed the man wrestling with his remaining strength, and in an instant, the elderly body went completely lifeless. So Gaius did what he couldn't even contemplate before: he killed a man.
And then he placed the emperor's ring on his finger, emerged from his chamber, and reported, "Tiberius has passed away. He left me this ring." At that moment, everyone understood. If Caligula possesses Tiberius's ring, he is the successor of Caesar. The streets of Rome celebrated the death of the tyrant. Finally, they could breathe freely. The fool and despot Tiberius was dead. There were calls from all corners to cremate his body. And who is the successor? The army had already decided long ago. The people also agree. It's the little boot, Caligula. In the midst of their joy, the Romans did not even suspect that their prosperity would soon transform into a monster that their mighty empire had never encountered before. The day following Tiberius's demise, Gaius stood at the center of the Senate, a mere 25 years of age, and yet already the sovereign of the world's largest and most potent empire. Henceforth, his new name is Gaius Caesar Caligula. He has just been declared emperor. In those joyous days, Gaius Caligula more than ever missed his parents, who would have been proud to have such a son. The man pledged to himself that he would never dishonor his father's memory. Eventually, the Roman people will erase the memory of their misfortunes. They will forget the tyrant Tiberius. He will devote himself fully to serving people and leave a lasting good impression, just like his father did. A few months passed, and the contented Romans already referred to their young emperor as Sunshine. He declared amnesty for all those persecuted by Tiberius and dismantled the system of denunciations. "I have no ear for informers." This was the primary motto at the start of his rule, and Caligula also augmented the state's grain reserve to ensure that Rome would always have bread.
However, he would do all of this later, and right after his appointment, the first thing Gaius did was sail to the island where his relatives were in exile. He discovered the graves of his mother and brothers on his own, and transported them to Rome under the cover of night, away from prying eyes. Over the graves, he whispered, "I have fulfilled my vow."
At this time, close to the palace, those whom he cherished the most were waiting for him. His sisters, among whom was his beloved Drusilla. He only recently found out, much to his regret, that his beloved sister is married. She tied the knot in Capri with a man significantly older than her. This was the last order of Tiberius in his life and his greatest revenge against Caligula. Drusilla did not belong to him, but to someone else, and though he could embrace her gently, like a sister, another emotion surged within him, a burning, passionate, and forbidden one. He loved this woman. She was the only one he ever noticed and desired. Until now, it was unconsciously, secretly. However, the second sister evoked genuine concern from her brother, leading him to take what he believed to be a step towards creating a new family. He arranged for his sister to marry his loyal friend, the gladiator Gnaeus. Such was his gift for inspiring loyalty. Everything was going splendidly. Headaches were becoming less and less bothersome. State affairs were on the upswing. People adored him. He had a multitude of friends and a new family. There was no need to further humiliate yourself and anticipate death every day.
However, the Old Testament's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth principle never left. The emperor lost his peace of mind forever the night he met his demise.
Watch without commercial interruptions. The ghost of a vengeful Tiberius is an ominous harbinger of impending disaster. Caligula teeters on the brink of life and death. Refined torment by a psychopathic tyrant.
This event will be discussed for a long time.
Incestuous relations with his own sister and orgies in the imperial baths. Caligula was sleeping restlessly. He was alone in the room. Suddenly, something awakened the emperor. He heard a rustle in the room, opened his eyes and froze. In front of him, ravaged by leprosy, stood old Tiberius, his mouth contorted from suffocation and his eyes bulging out. And suddenly, in the ring, visions flashed as if in a mirror. The river is stained red with blood. The imperial baths in the palace are filled with faces. Dozens, hundreds of hanged, murdered, strangled individuals. And finally, Caligula saw himself on the throne adorned with a wreath of intertwined severed hands.
He yelled, bolted out of the room, and dashed through the corridors of the palace, shouting something about a curse. And when he was put to bed, Caligula suffered a severe seizure. He relapsed into the disease. This disease was now hundreds of times more potent and dangerous.
Sun, light up the sky. For 2 long months, the crowd near the palace did not disperse. People were waiting for news about the health of their emperor. And Caligula battled a fever. He was tormented by an unidentified illness, and it was no longer epilepsy, even though the fever alternated with its episodes. The doctors couldn't identify the type of disease, nor how to alleviate the patient's condition. Modern doctors have only identified this disease by its symptoms. Caligula suffered from acute encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain.
When encephalitis is in its acute phase, it presents with severe headache, high fever, and confusion, putting a person on the brink of life and death. And so it turns out that after encephalitis, the most challenging aspect arises. Personal changes can occur, similar to the case of Caligula.
The Romans could not have known what awaited their pet and themselves as a result of this disease. They hoped for Caligula's recovery, and a month later, they were informed that the emperor was feeling better. The people celebrated this recovery because they had grown to love Caligula during this brief year of his just and wise reign. And Gaius himself changed. His constant companion now was a headache. He became melancholic and distrustful, agitated by the smallest things. I tried to comprehend what happened to him, why his desire to live disappeared, why everything became bitter, and why, at sunset, I'm overwhelmed with such deep longing that I consider taking my own life.
Undoubtedly, the reality is that any brain inflammation, whether it's meningitis or encephalitis, results in irreversible personality changes. Firstly, the person is never fully cured. They may experience a sudden, unprovoked headache that they cannot alleviate. An individual searches for so-called triggers, in other words, the sources of their own headaches or mood swings, and harshly confronts those who might be triggers.
He completely lost the ability to sleep. He could only manage to doze off for a few hours during the day. Even then, fear would not leave him alone. He didn't know what he was afraid of, and that was the most frustrating thing. And at night, the worst would begin.
That's how he survived the initial bouts of aggression, shattering the dishes in his room. One day, in his haste to gather the fragments, he noticed his own bloodied hand. After that, there was a sudden relief. It was then that these elements became forever intertwined in the young emperor's troubled imagination: pain, blood, and relief. This is how another Caligula was born, one who attempted to alleviate his own physical pain with blood and inscribed his name in history with bloody letters.
In the morning, they had breakfast. Exhausted from pain and sleepless nights, Caligula tasted the food and became furious. He ordered the cook to be called. "Why does the food smell rotten?" The chef threw up his hands. The emperor's eyes were bloodshot.
This incident will be discussed for a long time. The chef was bound at the waist with a rope, then 4 liters of undiluted wine were forcibly funneled into him. Caligula himself oversaw the process while continuing to have breakfast. An hour later, the martyr's bladder gave in and the cook met a horrific death.
Everyone at the table lost their ability to speak and their appetite, while Caligula laughed loudly and crazily. The execution, the sight of blood, it brought him the relief he had been longing for.
In other words, he constantly felt as though he was in a state of decline, deteriorating, and thus, witnessing the suffering of others gave our protagonist a sense of relief. Today, they are dying, not me. And the more he inflicted pain upon them, the more alive he felt.
In the evening, the pain resurfaced, reminding him of all that had transpired. It was as if he had awoken from forgetfulness, and he wept. A revelation occurred. He was haunted by a sense of guilt. To alleviate this burning sensation, Gaius ordered 20,000 sesterces to be paid to the family of the executed cook, a significant sum at that time. However, it did not provide relief. He groaned again from lack of sleep, and at that groan, the door suddenly opened. Barefoot and clad only in a shirt, Drusilla entered his room and did the only thing she could. She hugged the ailing emperor and cradled his head in her lap, just as she had done in their childhood. And for the first time in a long while, he felt relief. This is how another relationship was conceived in the tormented mind: pain, solace, relief. The emperor reached out for her. She cradled his head. They were both frightened and embarrassed. They couldn't even explain to themselves how it happened. All they knew was that they were in love. This forbidden sentiment originated in their childhood, and now they defied all restrictions. She was his sister. She was married, but Gaius wished to be by her side day and night, just as he used to be when they were children.
What do tyrants and satraps typically do? Correct. They often exploit women, finding no genuine joy in any of them. However, in this case, it's the opposite. He was involved with many women, probably always realizing that his sister was superior. So it's just a certain fascination with the past. In this case, by fascination, we mean not just an intimate attraction to the dead, but an intimate attraction to the past. A man who lived in the past, hence he sought revenge. That's why he couldn't forgive.
Drusilla's husband did not dare to make claims against Caligula himself. Instead, he voiced his complaints about the corrupt emperor to the senators, and soon enough, the Senate was filled with horrifying tales of Caligula's orgies and banquets, where they indulged in adultery for amusement, not only with slave girls, but also with the wives of respected citizens. The rumor spread, incorporating unbelievable new details. Roman officials decided to put an end to this chaos. For them, it was sacrilege. The rebellion against the emperor was initiated by the Senate itself, but it was so poorly planned that the mutiny was quickly discovered in the royal palace. Caligula determined their fate simply. He commanded the execution of 40 senators. Under the executioner's axe, they cursed Gaius and labeled his sister a harlot. Caligula was furious. Let him be scorned, but no one dares to insult Drusilla even with a single word. It didn't take long for the Senate to respond. He was standing by the fire, holding an urn filled with ashes in his hands. This vessel holds all that remains of the woman she loved. Drusilla passed away unexpectedly. They were having dinner yesterday when she suddenly fell ill. He suspected poisoning and implored the doctors to do everything possible to save his beloved, but the poison was too potent. So he lost the last person he was capable of loving. Grief from the loss, sleepless nights, panic attacks, and severe headaches, all of these, combined with absolute power and impunity, quickly transformed the young emperor into a monster.
These personality alterations, his crude behavior and utter incompetence, are most likely due to the pathology of the frontal lobes of the brain.
Вероятно всего обусловлены патологией лобных долей головного мозга.
This is how modern neurology and psychiatry interpret certain behavioral reactions, which, incidentally, were also characteristic of Caligula. Indeed, his rule was notable for these antics.
Initially, his antics only scared his subordinates, reinforcing the notion that the emperor was not fully sane, and then mass executions began. As his illness advanced, the number of people he executed increased. When he was informed that the price of livestock, used to feed wild animals for spectacles, had increased, Caligula became furious and ordered human flesh to be thrown to the animals. Over the next month, several hundred slaves were sent to be thrown to the lions. He ordered his cousin Caligula to be executed for allegedly arriving at the palace for a banquet after taking an antidote. Did you think I wanted to poison you? A poet who composed a poem about an emperor he disliked was burned at the stake by Caligula in the center of the amphitheater. Shortly thereafter, he committed a crime that estranged his last loyal friend, Gnae, and his own sister. Walking through the corridors, he saw her, remembered Drusilla. His head started spinning, and then Caligula forced himself upon his sister. And after that, he organized a lavish banquet. The last meal of his life.
They say that at that banquet, Caligula happened to notice a slave stealing a silver spoon from the table. He immediately became angry and demanded the petty thief be punished. They severed his hands and hung them around his neck. Then they were made to walk around the table. The scared guests scattered, and the enraged Caligula heard the voice of his friend Gnaeus.
Caligula. Caligula looked at him and did not recognize Gnaeus. In his eyes, Caligula saw not just hatred, but also the murderous fervor of a beast hunter. Gaius felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. He turned to Gnaeus and froze in horror. He held a gleaming blade in his hands. Knives struck him in the back from various directions simultaneously, and then Caligula experienced the much-coveted relief. As if he had already been forgiven. His power and his torment lasted only 4 years. He died before he turned 30. And he will forever remain one of the most brutal tyrants in history. A few months will pass, and his raped sister will give birth to a son. The boy will be named Nero. Gnaeus will recognize him as his own in front of people, but he will never love him. Hearing at little Nero, he will recognize Caligula in him for the rest of his life. And Nero will grow up happy. Until one moonlit night when he feels his head explode with pain.